Hi, I'm Dante.
And I'm Tommy.
And you're listening to Twigging Onto Twig, a podcast where we talk about Wildbow's most biopunk web serial, Twig.
And no longer least podcasted work. In today's episode, we take a look at Taking Root 1.1 and 1.2.
Yeah, and my first thoughts on these two chapters is that there's just so much detail. It's so intricate, so many things. We could talk about this for hours, but we're going to try not to.
Yeah, that might be a bit too much. But yes, just first two chapters, there's so much to dig into.
Mm-hmm. So let's jump right in with the very first words, which are the title of the arc, Taking Root.
So yeah, obviously, there's a lot to say. Well, I don't know if there's a lot to say about that, but there's definitely some stuff to say about the title itself. First, obviously, this is the first arc of the story, so roots that are being put down in terms of narrative. We're setting up the framework upon which the whole story will be fed. And similarly, or I don't know if similarly, but roots in general can be pretty insidious, worming into cracks, into fissures, and breaking stone down into like smaller pieces, wearing down structures slowly. So, as we talked about in the opening episode, that's such an integral part of the biopunk setting, the sort of resistance against these oppressive power structures.
Mm-hmm. Sort of a grassroots type thing, grassroots approach to dealing with the establishment. Also, one thing that I thought of while I was reading these two chapters was the way that this group of kids that are our protagonists are rooting out the monsters so that they can be taken care of by the academy.
That is true. I hadn't made that connection with the word root and a different definition of the word root.
I'm pretty sure every possible definition of the word root is going to be relevant, and so we're going to have to keep an eye on this because we'll revisit this conversation at the end of the arc.
Ideally. So I know you said you wanted to talk about the first line of the work here.
Yeah, so I think that first lines of works are really interesting because they have such an important role in sort of grabbing your attention and priming your brain to be in the right frame of mind.
Setting up expectations.
Exactly. And Wildbow has done such a good job with really strong first lines in his two previous web serials. So I wanted to have a look at this one. But this one is not so punchy. It's more kind of academic. It starts like this. How does it go? The first lesson, something even the uninitiated know. For life to flourish on the most basic level, it requires 4 elements: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And I thought that was a really interesting first line because it's not really punchy, but it's interesting.
It also, I thought, kind of set up Sai as a character in that his mind's always racing to different things, at least as far as we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it introduces the important focus of biochemistry because that's what it's talking about in the story. To me, I think, because we're talking about the basic elemental building blocks, it tells us like those are things we should be focusing on. The building blocks of this universe, of this story that we're going to be seeing in the next few chapters.
Of the characters.
And also, like you said a minute ago, is that it gives us some insight into Sai's head, that he's the sort of person who is, facing down a monster, and what does he think of? Oh, well, how do the first lesson in biochem apply to this current situation?
And this is very interesting, too, because it's something that we're definitely going to talk about when we get to the characters later, but it seems to be very much how our main character, Sai, operates. He's setting up, he's thinking moves ahead of the situation that he's in at the moment.
Yeah. So even though this first line isn't as punchy as some of the other first lines that we've seen from Wildbow, it certainly is doing a lot of heavy lifting and doing a very good job of it.
Yeah, setting us up for expectations.
Exactly. And speaking of setting us up, we get a whole lot of stuff going on. So let's do a plot summary as we go into our plot section of our episode.
So in 1.1, we start with a group of children in a barn-turned-warehouse escaping from a hungry, cat-like, snake-like monster. We learn a few things about the world. We learn that they work for Radom Academy, which controls all the biotech, informing them of dangerous monsters that need to be dealt with. And we also learn that Psy lies. They break into the lab area of the warehouse where they are caught by the mad scientist. He injures Psy, burning him with digestive enzymes. And then they manipulate the situation so that the scientist's monster kills the scientist.
And eats him whole.
And
in 1.2, the children are heading back through town, supporting and tending to the injured Sylvester. On the way, they have a conversation with a posh lady named Mrs. Thetford. When they arrive at Lambsbridge Orphanage, they debrief with Mr. Hale. And then Hale and Sylvester head off to the academy to look after Sly's injuries. Sly engineers a situation so he can get hold of Hale's files. He gets caught, but Hale lets him have a look at them anyway, and he looks at the research notes about each person in his group, and then finds what he's looking for: expiration dates.
So, you said that the first line of these two chapters was not super punchy, but that is a very punchy ending line.
Oh, absolutely. This is really compelling. I feel like 1.1 is just kind of like a short story.
Agreed.
And it just like introduces the setting and introduces the characters. And then 1.2 is like a bridge that connects between that initial short story and the main story. And then that one line at the end, expiration dates, is like the hook that says, here's where we're going to get started with what this story is actually, what is actually going to happen moving forward.
Yeah, it's like the in a TV show or a movie, the pre-credits thing. I think it's called a stinger, where it sets you into the action. Usually, it's in media res, and you get a bunch of action and stuff, and then it sets up the point of the movie or the episode right before the opening credits roll. Mm-hmm. And I can totally see that the expiration dates and then Twig taking root.
Exactly. So because this is all pre-credits stuff, it's a bit too early to really know where the plot of the story is going. But I did find that just the first chapter, being a sort of short story unto itself, it had a really good plot. It was, the tension was good, and the adventure of infiltrating and taking down the scientist there. I thought it was a really fun story. Like, even if it wasn't the first chapter of the whole book, I thought, this is a really good story just on its own.
And it definitely sets us up a little bit to what to expect from these characters. It introduces all the characters kind of one by one. It introduces the world. It sets up, it sets us up for everything else that's going to come. It gives us the role of Psy and the rest of the kids in the world itself. They give us a different look at the different characters and the world itself. So, I can see that this first chapter, or first two chapters, but really the first chapter, because as you said, it's sort of a self-contained story, sort of setting up a structure that will follow, at least for a little bit, as we get to know the characters. They go in, they take care of a problem, and then they go back home to rest and heal up, and then get sent on another mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if that's going to be what we'll see in the story moving forward, but definitely we get the impression that this is what their life is like, and their day to day.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. So we mentioned the characters and the world building. I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the world building itself first, before we got into the meat of the thing with the characters. So as a general note, I found it very interesting that the aesthetic is very soot-soaked Victorian, but instead of soot, it's plants and rain. And the two, kind of combine in my head as something out of the Upside Down from Stranger Things. It's dirty, it's grimy. Mm-hmm. It very has that Dickinsonian aesthetic, but rather than factories spewing smog everywhere, it's rain and cloud cover and plants and pollen everywhere.
Yeah, I actually found that really interesting because, we know from the introduction that this is taking place in 1921, but it definitely does feel Victorian, which, is a good, 20 years previously?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, whatever it is about, the technology or just the culture or whatever, they're several decades behind the times, and we're getting I feel like comparing this to like Victorian, what we know of the Victorian era literature in the Victorian era is more relevant than trying to compare it to stuff in like the 20s.
That is true, but there's also an interesting thing to note, is that the early 20th century, and the 20s still count as early 20th century, or late 1800s, which are technically post-Victorian, are still rife with industrial atrocities. And this is kind of what we're looking at in terms of the world building. Sy notes that things so overgrown and reeking of decay were the parts of the city charged with progress. And to me, that doesn't feel ironic at all, despite what Sy is saying. Because, you think about The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, or The Radium Girls, or like all the picture of children with mangled hands. It's always the common people who are ground down by the wheels of progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it might be ironic in this universe, but it's ironically true in real life as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
For sure.
You can't build, or the society cannot build without the progress, without the bodies being fertilizing the plants, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of plants, I found the plants really interesting. Like you mentioned, that there's plants here instead of soot for the aesthetic. But like these plants are weird. Like the story mentions that the plants are used to strengthen buildings and shore them up. And that's kind of the opposite of what plants usually do. Like we mentioned when we were talking about the arc title, plant roots usually get into crevices and crumble buildings and tear them apart.
Yeah, no matter how pretty ivy on the side of a stonework building is, it's destroying the building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but in this case, they're using it to strengthen buildings. So, that's also kind of a bit of an ironic aesthetic choice there as well. Yes, and also the fact that the ivy is red instead of green. First of all, it makes you think of blood and that sort of gory aesthetic that probably we're going for. But,
absolutely. It's like the whole world is covered in these parasitic tendrils, sort of sucking up everything that's good and dragging it or bringing it back into, the heart.
Yeah. But that's the thing, because red plants, I was trying to figure out, is it, because there are red plants. There are plants that are just red all the time. Because usually when you see a red plant, it means it's dying. But these are clearly not dead plants everywhere. Some of them are. He says, there's new growth that's red, and then everything else was dead. But usually the red means that it's dying.
Right.
But, so I was like, what's going on here? Are these, is this just a color choice? Or is there maybe something going on with that? And I looked it up, and it looks like plants that are red all the time, usually it's because either they're parasitic, so they don't need to get the nutrients through chlorophyll as much, or they've got anthocyanins, which apparently protects against temperature fluctuations. So I'm not sure about the temperature fluctuations being relevant, but the idea that these are dying and / parasitic plants, in addition to that sort of bloody color theme, I think all of those are very symbolic of just this universe that we're setting up.
Though, you're saying that you don't know if the protecting against temperature fluctuations is necessarily that relevant to the thing, but I can absolutely see it being super integral to something that you're using to shore up your structures. I believe it's mentioned at some point that it's the oldest buildings and the newest buildings that have these plants holding them up. And if you're building buildings, you want them to be able to last for many, many seasons. And we don't yet know where this is taking place. Like we've said, it feels Victorian, which implies England, but we have nothing confirming that yet. Mm-hmm. So for all we know, they do deal with very harsh winters and hot summers.
That's true. So when they talk about constant rain, maybe it's just constant rain and snow.
Yeah. And I mean, that's part of why, the mind automatically goes to England, especially in this context of this kind of fiction. It does absolutely make you think of constant rain. It's gray and dirty and smoggy and unpleasant overall.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did try and look to see if there was, like, we don't know where this place is, but I also tried to look, like, is there any such place as Radham anywhere? And not only is that not the name of any real town or anywhere that I could find, it doesn't even seem to be, like, a popular name of anyone that it could be named after,
Interesting.
or, like, there was nothing. Like, apparently it is a obscure word in Sanskrit, so there's a few like Indian web pages that popped up, but like it appears to be just a completely fictional word with no connection to anything. So
That's
there's no clues to get in that direction that I could find.
okay, because that's something that I kind of also was curious about, because it sounds very English to me. If I
It
remember that the
does.
suffix ham is, I believe, Anglo-Saxon, not Norse, but Anglo-Saxon for like a field or a farm or something along those lines. Let me Google that, make sure I am
I
not
think it means
lying.
like a home
Ham. The suffix ham
or
can be
like a
taken from one
homestead.
of two words. Yeah, the Saxon word meaning settlement, or ham meaning water meadow. So it
Okay.
does
So
place
both.
us, in theory, somewhere in Saxon England, because all the names are clearly not Sanskrit. Or,
I would be very
uh,
surprised if this ended up being in India.
yeah, very much. But this could also be in North America,
Yep.
depending on how heavily the alternate history happens here. So,
Hmm.
you know,
Oh, I did notice. At one point, they mention something being paid for in dollars and
I
not
noticed that as
pounds.
well. Yes,
So that could be an indication of North America, or maybe they use dollars in the UK in this universe.
it's possible. But yeah, you were also saying Radham is not a real place. They do imply, or the writing implies, that it's a fairly recent place that kind of is an outgrowth of the academy itself.
Hmm.
And before that was just a small crossroads town with just a few houses and not really a name. So
Hmm. I wonder
it's,
what
it's
I
go
wonder
ahead.
what got that. What their thinking was like. Oh, let's build an academy in this nothing crossroads.
Maybe just having enough space.
Maybe it's like one of those medium-sized cities that's like
Yeah,
within an hour of like a big metropolis,
that makes sense. Just
and so they're
somewhere in
like, oh
Connecticut.
well, we'll build the academy close enough, but outside the city, and that's where
There's
Adam comes from.
there's also the very real possibility that it was built somewhere in the middle of nowhere as sort of a containment thing. If something escapes, you don't want it, as we
Oh,
see the cat snake doing, preying on the people of the town.
that's an interesting thought.
And then, for practicality reasons or whatever, the town builds up around it and sort of negates the whole point of having built it out in the middle of nowhere.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of that. I like that theory.
Because it kind of implies that, you know, maybe the system was originally set up with good intentions, and just the profit and the practicality, outdid that or took that down.
Hmm. Something to keep an eye on, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like it kind of plays into what we talked about a little bit in the first episode, and a little bit this episode, is in terms of social structures and social hierarchies, where the academy and the academics don't, they're safe, they're secure, and they send out their tools to take care of problems. They don't do anything
Hmm.
themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I kind of wanted to also bring up the warehouse where the cat snake makes its home.
Yeah, that's a pretty
Because
significant part of the story so far.
absolutely. But yeah, on my first read through, I didn't catch that this was a barn and then a warehouse and then turned into the scientist lab. But I think kind of the transition there is an important one, because it sets up the aesthetic of the setting, kind of like really reinforcing the alternate historyness of it, because agriculture transitioning to industry at the turn of the 1800s is kind of what happened in our world. A lot of barns and structures turning into warehouses, but here it seems to have been aborted in favor of these wet sciences. Um,
Okay.
so setting up, potentially, this would have been our world, but for the discovery of all of the stuff that we're seeing, the biopunkness of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, so then this building that we're taking place in is just kind of a symbol of the whole world
Yeah,
history. That's
exactly.
fascinating. Good catch.
And I also wanted to note that Psy or Wildbow, but clearly Wildbow has a reason for this. Psy or italicizes the word trough, which I guess you probably didn't catch doing it via audiobook.
Nope.
Yeah.
I was like, I saw this in your notes, and I'm like, oh, that's a thing that happened. Interesting.
And I don't know what. There's a few other places I should have noted down where there's a word that's italicized, for emphasis, but I'm not sure what the emphasis is meant to be. So the sentence reads as, the makeshift gutter was little more than a trough, with that word italicized, with little care given for the leaks here and there, and it fed into wooden barrels at the edge of the upper floor, with more channels and troughs leading into subchambers and tanks below. So I don't know if there's anything, if I'm, looking too deeply at something that doesn't need to be looked at all. Mm-hmm. Or if there's a reason or meaning behind that. So
yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's italicized because Sai is splitting hairs here. He's like, oh well, it's not actually a gutter; it's more like a trough. And then he's like trying to emphasize the difference between those two things, and that's why it's italicized. I don't know.
Yeah, and kind of setting up maybe just for us to get a bit of Sai's character, because that's kind of something that, to be honest, I don't really remember if it comes up much during these two chapters, but it's something I do remember from the little bit I read further, that Sai can be pretty pedantic. He has to be right. So
this would definitely underscore that.
Yeah, so I can definitely see that being the reason, as you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have anything else you want to say about the warehouse and the cat snake's home?
No, not really. But if we're talking about the locations within the story, the next one we see is the Lambsbridge Orphanage, which is a really picturesque sort of place, isn't it? With this wall next to the brook, and
absolutely, it's a haven. It feels. Yeah. It's not at all described as such, but it feels like a ray of sunlight shining down.
Yeah, and even when he remarks on various aspects of it that are run down, it's like it's a wholesome and cozy sort of rundown.
Yeah, Sai finds it, a place of comfort. He describes the walls, and Sai seems like the kind of person who would hate being hemmed in anywhere as a comfort. Sort of separating this orphanage symbolically from the rest of the city, from the academy, from everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you noted that it predates the city as a building, which I thought also was super interesting because it shows that it's not part of the system, or at least it's become part of the system, but wasn't meant to be originally.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's like a last holdout of the good old days.
Yeah,
of that sort of rural bliss or whatever it is that
bucolic.
Yeah.
I also wanted to call out the name of Lambsbridge.
Okay.
Because it's a pretty meaningful name, I think. And while it still sounds very 19th century British, very appropriately,
mm-hmm.
Lambs, definitely have a meaning of innocence, a connotation of innocence, but it also lambs are very much things that are sacrificed and offered up, and the what's the word that I'm oblations. One that a lamb, while still is cute, is wholesome and all that, it's still something that's very that needs protection, or otherwise something else is going to eat it or take it and use it.
Sure, yeah.
And obviously, a bridge generally, the place itself is described as having a stone bridge over the river, over the creek, but a bridge
is
the
name.
Yeah, transition of getting from one thing to another thing over a barrier. So We'll see how relevant it is. I kind of am willing to predict, I'll put that down as a bold and specific prediction, that we're not going to have this haven as a safe place for very long in the story.
Okay, well, I'll definitely keep an eye out for that one.
And I think the last bit of location that we do see here is the academy, and it kind of shapes everything.
Mm-hmm.
Sai notes, the academy loomed above it all, those same elements taken to an extreme. It had been an old collection of buildings once. A rush to grow and meet surging demands had led to a lot of the same haphazard growth. So it's this big building looming over the city.
Yeah, it feels like that big evil superstructure that appears in literally every dystopian book
absolutely.
or show that you've ever seen.
It's heavy.
It's heavy, yeah.
Yeah, and we see with the snake charmer himself how much this, it's kind of I guess it is an ivory tower for these academics. In theory, people have a way in. There's a meritocratic structure to it, but the reality of it is as in reality, it's all about who you know and how much or what you can bring and give to the academy to be let in.
Yeah, for sure.
So again, as we said, very much the getting in heavy on the social hierarchies and oppressive structures right from the beginning.
Yep, really underlines this is the big dystopian establishment.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that our main characters are part of that structure at the beginning. Normally we see people who are the resistance and the rebellion often happens from people who are outside of the structure.
Usually and, some of their victims.
Exactly. Or they get help from someone who's dissatisfied, but it's rarely someone who's, wholeheartedly part of the system. Well, for various definitions of wholeheartedly, but wholeheartedly part of the system.
Well, maybe this will be one of those ones where we see the big bad taken out from the perspective of the big bad, or one of the cogs in the machine.
I can see that.
That would be an interesting perspective for sure.
Absolutely. And before we get to the characters, you wanted to talk a little bit about historical references.
Yeah. So I really find it really interesting when Wildbow makes a connection to some aspect of history or mythology or whatever, and uses that as scaffolding for his world building. And we found a couple of these names being dropped here and there in these chapters. We saw Cy referring to Wallace's Law, which is essentially the in-universe equivalent of Darwin's Law, survival of the fittest.
Yeah, so I Googled Wallace's Law just to see, what I could get, and brought this up. To answer this question, Alfred Russel Wallace, a contemporary of Darwin's, so we're already in the right time and science, proposed the Sarawak Law. Every species has come into existence coincident both in space and time with pre-existing closely allied species. So in other words, new species evolve from existing ones rather than simply appearing where they are, which is interesting in the context of Twig, because species are clearly being created whole scale without being related.
Yeah. We saw
the
cat snake. Cats and snakes are hardly
closely allied species.
I also did a bit of looking on this, and Wallace is actually a pretty interesting character.
Oh, yeah?
Because he came up with the idea of natural selection independently of Darwin.
Interesting.
And so when he published this book where he proposed this Sarawak Law, Darwin essentially wrote to him and was like, hey, I see that you and I are kind of working along the same page. Maybe we should compare notes. And so they did. And then Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and Wallace was like one of his proponents of his theories in the scientific society. So I think it is very interesting that Wallace is chosen here to be sort of the replacement of Darwin, because he did actually do that research and come to the same conclusions at approximately the same time.
Kind of makes one wonder what happened to Darwin here.
Yeah. Maybe he got chopped up and turned into a stitch.
That's certainly possible.
When was Darwin, and when was Origin of Species?
I'm looking that up right now. Origin of Species, book by Charles Darwin, published in 1859.
Okay, so that is well within the century since the invention of the stitch technology that was established in the introduction in our last episode.
Yep.
So definitely, Wallace and Darwin are already within this system of biotech.
But apparently it still happened early enough that someone was able to codify, namely Wallace, this concept of the survival of the fittest.
Yeah, it's interesting that that they would be able to make these this technology before having that that theoretical backdrop.
Well, it's interesting also because presumably, well, I guess there's a difference between the Stitched, which is very Frankensteinian monster and whatnot, to the cat snake type creatures or Mrs. Thetford's kind of horrifying
Yeah, that's
feeble
true.
thing, because you run electricity on these big bolts on a thing's neck that you stitch back together. It's kind of different than stitching together the DNA of such disparate species. So when was Mendel around? When did he do his work?
He was a lot more recent, I think.
He died in 1884, so can't have been that much, but
okay.
But still, yeah. So I'm wondering, I wonder where these historical figures that we know in the context of biology, where they fall in this system, in this world that is far in advance to ours at that time. In theory,
I'm sure that being rather tangential to whatever is going to happen in this story, that a detailed history of science in this universe is probably not something that we'll get a very full picture of, but it's still really interesting to see the hints of it coming through.
Well, it just builds the world up a bit.
Exactly.
Adds depth and that the world exists beyond the scope of our characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the other name drop that I saw was when Cy finds all the papers on the desk and he finds references to Woolstone's text, to the ratios of life and the volumes of genetic code for Felidae and Eunectes murinus, which is, cats and anacondas. Woolstone is not anyone in particular's actual name, but Wollstonecraft is. Mary Wollstonecraft was the mother of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. And in fact, Mary Shelley herself, her own middle name was Wollstonecraft. So I think it's interesting here. We see, even if it's not a real person in this case, like Wallace is, he's still taking inspiration from, relevant historical figures and borrowing their names for the backdrop of his story.
Well, I find that
super interesting.
A bit of a spoiler for Boyle. For anybody who hasn't read that, it was a
Boyle
Wildbow's proof of concept for Twig.
Mm-hmm.
But in Boyle, the framework upon which the biopunk setting or the biopunk science is built was the Shelley Codex. So it's interesting that Wildbow seems to have stuck to that, but made it slightly more obscure.
Mm-hmm. So instead of Shelley, the name Shelley, it's the name Woolstone, which is taking the name from the same person.
Yeah, but just less well. Yeah, so that, I thought, that was I didn't make that connection until you pointed it out in the notes here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's all we have for world building and setting. So now we get into what I think is the meat of our discussion here, which is looking at the individual characters.
Yeah.
And starting out with the group of children, I just found it really interesting how Wildbow chose to introduce them. Because usually when you have a group of people, you'll have them introduced like, here's me, this is me, and then here are the other people in the group, Bob, Larry, whatever. But that's not what Wildbow does. He starts out with, dropping we are doing something. And then like a few paragraphs later, there's 4 of us. And then a few paragraphs later, we get Gordon is name dropped. And then a few minutes later, we get Helen and Lillian. And then we change scenes entirely and meet 2 other people who aren't even in that original group. And then we get Cy's name given to us. And this is just so backwards and so fun.
Well, I think it tells us something about Cy's perception of the kids that he's with, that he puts them first. He cares about them. We see that when Helen blames him to Mrs. Thetford. He says, I'm always the one, I always, what is it? I always get blamed. I'm used to it. So, he's used to being the one that takes the fall for the group. So he puts them first.
Yeah, definitely.
And so also I wanted to note that we do see that they all care for each other because, they're upset that Sylvester sets himself up to get hurt, to win.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and you see, like, when they contrast Lillian being new to the group, a lot of that really establishes how integrated and well meshed they are together.
yeah. And you mentioned Lillian being new to the group. It's interesting how, I think Hale says this is her third mission with the rest of them and gives her an out. And she says, well, I mean, the out is obviously not really an out since she can't stay at the academy unless she does this stuff. But it's still, she's clearly unnerved and not taking all that goes on very well compared to the rest of them, who seem to be pretty cool and collected all the way throughout.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I kind of wanted to bring up on that note about them being cool and collected is that, we learn at the end of these chapters that all of them, except Lillian, are academy projects. But we also learn that Hale, who is the one running the project, is someone who does brain work, not building people or bodies or cloning people. So it kind of makes me think that, they were potentially born, but the work that they were done is some kind of conditioning to do whatever is going on with them, rather than
very much like sort of trying to mold their personalities in certain ways.
Exactly, yeah.
Or, finding people. Oh, no, never mind.
Go ahead.
I was going to say maybe he's like found them as interesting people with traits that he wanted to study and copy, but he does say that he made them.
Yeah.
So that isn't a valid theory, but there's definitely an interesting approach to this.
Well, I can see an argument where where he says he made them, really coming from, I took these raw, unmolded things and I made you into the people you are now. So I think they're still...
Yeah, like what Mrs. Thetford says.
Exactly,
Helen,
yeah.
Like, they've molded you into the person you are, and I can give you lessons to mold you the rest of the way.
Yeah. And, I thought it was interesting how so much of the first chapter, there's emphasis on them being covered with the waterproofing wax, which, we learned to keep them out of the pheromone or the scent of the cat snake.
Which is just such a fun thing.
It really is. But then we learned that the stitched, need to be kept out of water, which kinds of sets us up, primes us for the revelation that, yes, this group of children are artificial. I mean, presumably they're not stitched because, as we see, the stitched are not, that versatile or smart.
Yep.
But it sets us up for learning that, they are not natural born, I guess, or they are a project.
Yeah, and we got some interesting hints as to what that's about with the project names at the very end of 1.2.
For sure. So do you want to go through them?
Yeah. So the first one we're introduced to is Gordon, project name Griffin.
So Griffins generally are associated with like nobility and chivalry and like strength. It's something that we kind of do see very much as being his role. He's the first introduced. He's in theory the oldest. I don't know if that's something I just kind of assumed.
No, he's not the oldest.
Right? They're all the same age.
It says that Lillian's the oldest and Gordon is second oldest.
Okay. So Gordon is older than the rest of the group.
But he's the tallest and the strongest, and he's the leader. And it's kind of a role that usually goes to the oldest in a group of children. So it's easy to make that
He's
assumption.
The Peter Pevensie or the
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But, we do see that some of that is a facade because he demonstrates that he can be ruthless and act in less than noble ways to win.
I thought it was actually really funny because Cy describes him as strong, handsome, likable, talented immediately before he turns on the snake charmer with his underhanded, ruthless side.
Yeah, which is, I don't know if that's Cy setting us up for that revelation or that switch, or if it's just, Cy just being used to how the group operates and,
But
strong.
it also shows that this idea of Gordon as being like the griffin, the chivalrous and noble one, that's definitely not the whole of his personality.
Oh, for sure. And we kind of see that's the face that he puts on for people too, is that Griffin one. When he
Mhm.
interacts with Mrs. Thetford, she tells him like, "Oh, you could be so. I could do so many good things with you. If I could wash away all the bad influence from Psy."
Yeah,
And it's like
exactly.
he's he's there on his own. He doesn't need Psy
Yep.
to drag him down. He can do what he's doing.
Very, very true.
Yeah.
And the next one we get introduced is Lillian.
Right. Who does not have a
Lillian
problem.
and Helen kind of together, but I think Lillian was the first one mentioned.
I believe
And,
so.
and she's the odd one out. She's not one of the projects. She's new to the group. She doesn't have that sort of mesh that everyone else does, but she still fits in. They all get along. Sai is teasing her like kids do.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that she is part of the group. I don't know why Hale would want someone who's not, one of his projects working with the projects, to like I don't necessarily get what her purpose in the group is for size and for Hale's perspective.
Well, they do say her job is to keep them alive.
Right, but in theory, couldn't Jamie do that, or Lillian, or not Lillian, sorry, Helen be taught to do what she was doing?
Or any of
utilize
them.
enzymes and bandage and whatnot.
Maybe he realized, oh, I should have made that, and I should have
Maybe
done that 10 years ago, and it's a bit too late, so I'll have to find a young, promising student who will take that role.
Yeah,
I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if we find out how Lillian got involved in this whole project.
especially considering she seems still like she's been with she's with the academy, so she's clearly gotten her hands dirty, and she's been with them on 3 missions. And if this mission's any indication of how they go, she's presumably had all to get her hands dirty there. But she still seems kind of innocent and put off by the grossness of what happened.
Yeah, she's definitely overwhelmed several times in this couple of chapters by the happenings, the cat snake and other things. So
Yeah. So
Lillian's a really fun character. I like her.
she's interesting. I'm really curious to see where this goes. And then the next one we meet is Helen, is Galatea.
Project Galatea.
And so that name comes to us from Greek mythology, and originally it's a marble or ivory statue carved by Pygmalion, who falls in love with his statue so hard that he prays to Aphrodite, who brings the statue to life to be his wife, which is kind of really gross. And we kind of see a little bit of maybe why that name comes to Helen, just because she's kind of statuish, like creepy, odd, unnerving.
Sai even says, while she's standing in the rain, he says she could have been a statue and she'd kept her face still enough that the wax that covered it hadn't broken. So that is pretty explicitly called out.
And I kind of got some feeling or some implication, kind of borne out by Helen's interactions with Miss Thetford and the way she interacted around like the rest of them, that maybe she's more artificial than the others. And maybe she's like designed to be an infiltrator or something like that.
Yeah.
Just the vibe I got from her.
The relation to Pygmalion also makes a link to the play Pygmalion and the musical My Fair Lady.
Yeah.
Especially where in that one, Eliza is made to be, behave perfectly and proper etiquette. And Helen also puts on this perfect etiquette behavior with Mrs. Thetford and then shucks it off again when she's gone.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I found also interesting that she seemed, I don't know if remorseful is the right word, but she's like, did it bother you that I blamed you? Or like, so. Yeah, so it's interesting how much of all she's doing is an act or putting up a facade.
Yeah.
But Helen, I think, is the most unnerving yet interesting. And especially considering, and this is going to be a pale spoiler, so jump ahead a little bit if you are not caught up on Pale, but learning that Helen, the horror practitioner, named herself after Helen from Twig is just so interesting in setting us up to where we're going with, like, that's setting up some expectations for who Helen is.
Yep.
All right.
Definitely.
And then the next one is Jamie.
Jamie, project name Caterpillar.
So a caterpillar is someone that, or something that undergoes a metamorphosis and changes, becomes something different. So I wonder if that's the point of his project, a transformation to something else.
Yeah, I don't really see anything like that. The closest thing I could think of to what we'd seen of him and the idea of caterpillars was like he's described as bookish. You know, he's got big glasses and, you know, that sort of aesthetic, but also he's carrying a book around. And I'm like, maybe he's like a bookworm, which some bookworms are moth caterpillars.
That is true.
So maybe it's like a reference to that.
Or at some point, Jamie's going to spin himself a cocoon and emerge with wings. I don't know.
Maybe project name Butterfly.
Bookfly, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Like we haven't seen much of Jamie so far. Besides, maybe a feeling that Sai cares for Jamie a bit more than the rest, since he kind of wants Jamie to be the, like, he couches it as, oh, you know, I don't have to like lean awkwardly if Jamie's helping me like I would for you. But like the feeling is that, you know, oh, I think I got the vibe that Jamie's a bit, you know, he wanted to be close to Jamie while he was hurt.
Right.
But yeah, we don't really get much of Jamie beyond that.
And then finally, after introducing all of the other ones, we get Sai, and then in the second chapter, we find out his full name is Sylvester.
I thought it was really interesting how occasionally he's referred to as Sai, sometimes as Sly, and obviously sometimes as Sylvester. Because obviously Sly is a word that has a meaning.
Yep.
Which is
similar to the sort of character that he's demonstrating himself to be.
Exactly.
Yes. Project name Wyvern.
So, a wyvern is also a mythological creature, which, to be honest, kind of leaves Jamie out as the one non-mythical one, which is a little sad. As caterpillar. But yeah,
caterpillars are mythological in this setting.
Yes, the extinct caterpillar. There are no more butterflies or moths. They just are gone. So yeah, a wyvern is a kind of dragon, but generally more snake-like. I believe dragons traditionally have 4 legs and wings, and a wyvern only has its hind legs and wings.
Yeah.
But yeah, the symbolism is, I think you pointed out, very variable.
Yeah, so I was like trying to figure out what does a wyvern generally represent, and it's all over the place. Like sometimes it represents courage and protection, and sometimes it represents power and tyranny, or even like the overthrow of tyranny, and sometimes it means violence, war, sometimes it means vengeance, sometimes it means plague and sickness, sometimes it means evil and sin. Like it's just all over the map. And I wonder if maybe the point of Sylvester is that, or Sylvester Project, is that it's kind of like all of those at once, in the sense that, like, you know, oh, we want somebody that we can, you know, if we need someone to be courageous and protective, then Sylvester can do that. But if we want somebody who's like evil and sinful, well, he could do that instead. Or if we need someone who's like vengeful, well, Sylvester could do that. So maybe like the disparate nature of what wyverns are supposed to be all about, maybe that's what this is about, rather than something specific like Gordon being a noble griffin or Helen being the statuesque Galatea. Sylvester is just like whatever they need him to be, sort of like a wild card type.
That's a really interesting point or thought, because yeah, we kind of see Sylvester, even in just 2 chapters, taking on a bunch of different roles as the situation called. You know, he obviously sets up the whole mechanism and the situation of getting the files, but also setting up the situation so that the snake catcher is defeated. He kind of keeps the rest of the group a little bit together by, I think, you know, kind of teasing the others a little bit and, you know, lightening the tone. Yeah,
we definitely see a lot of sides of his character in these 2 chapters, which is a lot for just a very introduction. He's definitely a very multifaceted
individual. Yeah, we see. I would like to say that it's a little bit altruistic, but he that Tom kid that shows up, he sets up a situation that ends up playing to his advantage later on, but still serves to get the kid out of the danger area.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm really curious and excited to see where we go with Sai.
Yeah, he's a very fun, and he's just fun to read too.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
just the way he describes things, and making little esoteric jokes to himself, and making fun of his friends, and joking in
Mhm.
the face of danger. Like he's really fun to read.
To be honest, so far I found him to be far more engaging as a protagonist to read than some of Wildbow's earlier ones.
Hmm.
Like, either Taylor or Blake are fun to read, but they don't have the same kind of, I don't want to say necessarily whimsy,
No, I think
but
whimsy is right.
okay, sure.
Maybe it has the wrong tone, but I think it's true nevertheless.
Yeah. So yeah, this is going to be an interesting perspective. An interesting character to follow their perspective.
Hmm.
Is there anything else you want to talk about with Sai?
I mean, we could be here for hours talking
Oh,
about Psy, but we still have some more stuff
yeah.
to talk about, so maybe we should
Yeah.
continue on.
One thing before we do move on from the main group of kids is that we probably need to resist this urge that I sort of found myself falling into to sort of stick them into a specific party role,
Hmm.
since they all clearly have strengths that overlap. It's not like Gordon is the tank and then Lillian is the cleric and
Yeah, you see
I
what the
the
problem
rogue.
is, though. Now that you've brought that up, we have to stick them into a party role.
Ah, of course. That is going to be a future discussion question. Um, create a
Okay.
D&D. Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
Okay, we'll save that for a future episode then.
yeah. So there were some other characters that show up. Obviously, the main focus is on the main characters. But we do see the first of these other characters that we see is Tom, but we don't really have much to say about Tom unless there's something you want to say real quick.
No, he's just a kid who exists and then leaves.
He's a prop in size
Yep.
plots. So the first real character we see is the Snake Charmer, and I kind of really want to note that I love that as a kind of code name because like it feels very apropos,
Mhm.
like very very of the time, dramatized pulp journaling name. And the other names that we get of like other things that they've taken care of have that same kind of feel as well. The Crying Man of Butcher's Row and Mother Hen does very feel like pulpy journalistic, creating
Oh,
these
yeah.
these dramatic monsters for the public to be afraid of and enjoy reading about. And
Hmm. Yeah, and we never even get his real name. He's just the Snake Charmer, which makes it even more so.
yeah, it kind of dehumanizes him.
Yes, definitely.
Like he's a monster. And we see that we see that he's a very desperate person. Like almost to the point of blindness. He refuses to acknowledge that his creature has done anything bad
Hmm.
until, it's rubbed into his face, and then he, acts out with resentment. But in the moment he's not like he doesn't want to accept that this golden ticket he has to the academy is not actually going to work.
Hmm. Yep.
And obviously also his resentment towards Lillian is made manifest, which makes Lillian also all the more interesting. Like how did she get in if
If this guy and his ilk are so incapable of meeting their exacting standards.
yeah, because clearly she got in through like her own merits and then just needed the Hale's scholarship to like stay in. But why her and not the probably thousands of other people just like her, like this guy?
Maybe she's like Hill's daughter or niece or something.
I feel like if that were the case, then she would have just gotten in.
Probably. There are a couple other characters that we kind of just briefly meet. Mrs. Thetford, obviously, who is an interesting lady. She strikes me as the sort of lady where a kid would see her coming and be like, "Oh no, not her."
Oh yeah, oh absolutely.
And of course, they're very polite to her, but
Don't want to be anywhere near her.
exactly.
Well, I'm curious about Mrs. Thetford and what role she occupies in society. Is she, how, because everything we've seen so far is that the Academy is at the heart of society, and everything comes from the Academy and flows to the Academy. So she is, I don't think she's described as an academic or anything like that. Is she just a independently wealthy woman? Is she, where does she fall into the society? Is she just part of the elite? And how does she know Helen and the rest of the group also? I think we're going to...
Yeah, she definitely has an in into that society, but it feels like she's more posh than like Mr. Hale and Mrs. Earl and like those kids. So
I cannot imagine her, arms deep in the guts of a cat snake.
Nope.
And yeah, Miss Earl also is interesting because, as you pulled out these notes from the chapters, that she's neither maternal nor tyrannical, which I think is interesting because that's so the stereotypes of people we see running orphanages.
And like that's what Sylvester calls out, as being what usually happens to people who are in Mrs. Earl's situation.
Yeah, they get dragged to the extreme, he says.
I get the impression that, she's just an ordinary person and probably relatively decent in her own way.
I think one would have to be to run an orphanage and not be awful about it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And I don't know how much of her we're going to see, and we don't see all that much of her here. But yeah, she's definitely worth mentioning because she's someone who's clearly formative for Cy.
Definitely.
Yeah, and the last character that we encounter, aside for a Stitched, is Mr. Hale.
Yeah, and a lot of what we said about Mrs. Earl can be said about Mr. Hale.
I don't know
Sylvester, about that. Sylvester says, Mrs. Earl has kind of the same role as Mr. Hale, as sort of a parent, but not really.
I suppose, but I kind of feel like that might be Cy projecting a little bit, or seeing something he wants to see. Because my read of Mr. Hale is very much I will take care of you because you are an investment, you are a project, you are time and effort that I've invested. I don't care about you as a person.
Yeah, but isn't Mrs. Earl like that too? Oh, you're one of my charges, and so I will take care of you, but I don't have any maternal relation to you either.
Maybe, but I feel like it's a bit more ominous coming from Hale, just because he controls everything, essentially.
Okay, interesting.
But I did want to note that he's much more observing. He's already set up as being much more, I don't want to say a threat necessarily, because he doesn't act as a threat. Cy sees him with some hostility as well as affection and paternal relationship. But he, the chapter itself says he frowned as he saw me, immediately taking in details that more than 100 people in the busier part of the city had failed to spot. So we already know that Cy, this is his first interaction with him that we see, and we already see that Cy can't get away with what he thinks he can get away with
right.
Hale.
Yep.
And obviously that comes to fruition at the end of the chapter when he gets the files. And Hale's, he fails getting the files with his plot that he set up with Tom, and Hale just gives him the files.
Yes.
So I don't necessarily have more to say about that. I just think it's going to be an interesting relationship to see.
Absolutely.
So there's a few other things that we want to talk about in our, as we've affectionately stolen, Monster Corner. So the first monster that we encounter is the cat snake. And I think you had some things that you wanted to talk about in terms of the cat snake and the creation thereof and whatnot. Yeah,
so we see that the cat snake is some sort of cross between a cat and a anaconda. I thought it was kind of interesting that, it specifies specifically the species of green anaconda, but just the general cat family. So I'm wondering if maybe this creature has a bit of different species of cat, maybe a bit of jaguar and a bit of wildcat and maybe a bit of tiger. And I'm actually, you pulled out as an anaconda, and I didn't do the little bit of research to look, but it's interesting that it's an anaconda because anacondas are not venomous, right? They're constrictors, if I remember correctly. Oh, that's true. Yeah. So yeah, it's just fascinating. But this one is also not venomous. It uses enzymes.
True.
Or does that count as a venom? Because I'm pretty sure Sai says that it's not really venom.
I don't know if it counts as a venom or not. But that's interesting that, either way, the snake charmer added something else to it that doesn't, do much. Like that's not part of the original either of the original creatures. I guess a cat all cats kind of kill you by sitting on your chest and suffocating you as you sleep, but I guess that wasn't what the snake charmer wanted out of this creature. And it's like, it kind of makes me wonder, like, what the purpose of this creature was meant to be.
Right. Yeah, because you'd think that based on what we see of its description, that its purpose is to just go around eating stuff.
Yeah.
It's not very useful.
Unless the whole point is to create monsters,
like we need a monster that just does monstery things.
Yeah, exactly. But again, that doesn't feel like it's practical or like sellable or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's why he didn't get into the academy, because he's producing these things that are not useful, really.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to point out that, this is his second experiment. We don't know what happened to the first, and if this is the second, and it's the second that Sai and this group had to take care of, presumably the first one was also snake related, if he's known as the snake charmer.
Well, they just called him the snake charmer after this chapter.
Don't they? I thought they referred to him as a snake charmer during their interaction with him.
Yeah. Like, that's kind of like at the end of the chapter, they come up with this name. They're like, oh, you've got a snake creature. We'll call you the snake charmer. I don't think that was something that he had been going by in his previous work. Like, they don't know what he did before.
Not like the journalists were, the snake charmer strikes again.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. And I kind of liked, you just deleted it from the notes. Never mind. I'll ignore it.
No, it's just like in my head, like trying to picture this creature. Randall from Monsters, Inc.
Absolutely.
It's like that was exactly the sort of picture I had in my mind of what this creature looked like.
I see it. I buy it. And then the other sort of artificial creature that we see is Miss Thetford's Beast of Burden, which was, I didn't copy the notes here, but it was described as, if I remember correctly, as like a giant rabbit fetus.
Something like that. Pink stretched skin and like tiny spindly legs that end in single claws. And I'm like, this seems like the most impractical beast of burden you could possibly have. Like, why not just get like a horse or a stitched horse and pile your stuff on that instead of having this top heavy,
gross
toothpick creature that looks like it's going to collapse under the weight of anything.
I really wonder if there's fan art of this creature out there. Miss Thetford and the fan art. I'd love to see that. If someone has some of that, please share it with us, because this thing just sounds so awful. Just like a tortured existence. Yeah. I don't know.
I wonder if maybe it's like meant to be some sort of status symbol. Like, oh, I'm so rich that I can afford to get a beast of burden that not only carries my burdens, but also looks like it's defying gravity as it does so.
Yeah, I can see it. It's like, conspicuous consumption. I'm so wealthy that I don't need my things to operate efficiently because I'm so rich that it's going to work out for me no matter what.
Yeah.
And maybe, it's an aesthetic thing. That's her look is horrific.
And also like, everybody, these are people who live near the academy. Presumably they see stuff like this all the time. And even then they're like crossing the road to get away from it. So maybe,
that is true.
Maybe Mrs. Thetford is just like, I need something that can carry my bags, but also like make everyone give me lots of personal space at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. She knows what she wants and she's going to get it.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you brought up the live horse as a status symbol, and that brings us to our next little thing. We're talking about the Stitched, which are essentially Frankenstein's monsters. And I kind of wanted to point out that, like, we picture Frankenstein's monsters as like humans, the big lumbering, brutish, stitched up human.
Yeah, and we do see a few of those in these chapters.
But we see more of, these stitched horses. And like Sai points out that, a live horse versus a stitched horse is wealth versus practicality, though I am not certain that I buy that, considering the stitched horses have to wear raincoats and stay out of the rain, whereas a live horse can be in the rain and it is raining constantly.
Yep.
But
Although
yeah,
probably a tarp is a pretty cheap investment
I suppose
compared
it's just
to like a paddock and feed and all that
fair
fun
enough.
stuff.
You just plug your horse in at night and ride
Yeah.
it to work in the morning. Yeah, no, it just sounds. I don't know. Just this whole setting sounds like a horrible place to live.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. But yeah, I kind of also wanted to talk about one of the other, like the stitched that we see. So the first real indication of anything more than just, oh, there's Frankenstein's monster comes from Tom when he's describing, or when Cy asks him if he's heard of the crying man of Butcher's Row. Describes the Stitch that went crazy, remembered things. And like that just sounds like I don't even know how to put into words how horrifying that is. Like I would assume that these are dead people and that there's nothing left of like the actual memories. They're like,
yeah, it says that like they take away all of its personality and reduce it to just simple function.
And that didn't work this case. Yeah.
But you still have the person in there somewhere underneath.
Which, yeah, maybe this one was created too early or too fast or something. But yeah, like it's not. It just indicates that these people that these Stitched are, in theory, presumably this person didn't have to become a Stitched.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you pointed out also, that's so interesting that the quality of Stitched is based on aesthetics and not other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Cy goes on about how like a good Stitch, has the joins and the scars are kept out of sight, and like that's the real difference between a good quality Stitch and a crappy one. But it's like, if you were going for something like intelligence or strength and not charisma, maybe you wouldn't care about where the stitches are, but it would still be a much higher quality. But no, not in this universe. In this universe, what we care about is, does it look pretty?
Yeah.
Despite being,
a dead thing
and, having no intelligence. And
yeah. Well,
so I thought that was just an interesting perspective. It's like, we don't care if it's unintelligent. We don't care if it is weak and whatever. So long as it looks less ugly than the other ones. Which
I guess tells us quite a bit about the society as well.
Despite the fact that, all of these creatures are just kind of like inherently horrifying looking anyway.
Yeah.
This one is slightly less horrifying. What good quality that is.
I also wanted to bring up Stitched a little bit. I didn't note this down, but when I was doing my live read, I talked about it a little bit. But the impacts presumably of Stitched on the labor market and how it's this setting's version of automation and, in theory, machinery taking away jobs from the living. Because presumably it's far cheaper to buy and have a factory running all night if you have just Stitched doing all the labor, because it's not labor that requires any kind of thinking or development or in an ideal society, this means that people could be, left to follow their passions. But in most biopunk or most settings in general, it just means that you just have hordes of super poor people out of jobs, and which means that those people are able to be abused and taken advantage of far more than if they had any kind of say and ability to have an income and some stake in the society itself.
Yep. Like in the society, they value these horrendous cobbled together creatures more than actual people.
Yeah, because the cobbled together creature is not going to complain, even if you light a fire in front of it.
Yep.
Yeah. Which was an interesting said that Cy was, thrown for a loop that this Stitch wasn't afraid of the fire, just locked up by the fire.
Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, look, cutting edge technology, not afraid of fire.
Yeah, it seems like a disadvantage. And I guess that's a place that some factories are going to still need humans.
For now.
Yeah. So our next bit is, normally we're going to talk about the discussion question, but we got a few answers, a lot of which we want to talk about a little bit. But
since we just released our last episode like a couple days ago, I think we're going to just keep the same discussion question, which was, what sort of topics or things do you want us to talk about in this podcast? And we got some good ideas, and I feel like we should call out some of them.
Absolutely. Though the first section that we really got questions about is literary / historical comparisons. So yeah, Bavarian Barbarian asked about comparing to Charles Dickens, whereas Walt Nader very much called out Frankenstein, which is the obvious connection, as well as Brave New World, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Island of Dr. Moreau. And Hobo Demon just wanted to know specifically about actually kind of what we just talked about, the cheapening of human labor through stitched workers. These are all themes that we're definitely going to be, and already have kind of, covering throughout this podcast.
Yeah. So, like, I haven't read all of the books that have been brought up here. And like Hobo Demon also mentioned real world historical figures and listed a few that were people I'd never heard of.
Yeah, same.
So absolutely, and as you've probably gathered by now from what we've discussed already, this is absolutely something that we want to do is find ties with other literary works and historical figures. But, if Wildbow drops a name like Wollstone or Wallace, we'll look that up and we'll learn stuff. But if he doesn't drop a name, then we won't know who to look into. So if you think there's an interesting historical figure or character from another work that would be worth comparing or looking into, like, absolutely, let us know. Pop it in the Reddit threads or send it to us, and we'll definitely be very interested to see where that goes.
Yeah. And one of the other general themes of questions, both Wolf Tamer 9 and TGR 42 alluded to it, talk about parenting.
Parenting, adolescence, children, coming of age, all those sorts of things. And of course, both of us having no children, or you not yet, I think we're definitely experts on all things about, adolescence. And
I was an adolescent once upon a time.
So anyway, I'm sure any commentary that we can make on the subject would come off as horribly naive, but that's not going to stop us from commenting on it anyway.
Absolutely. Bravely and boldly into the naivety. We definitely want to talk about it. And it's something that I think is really important to talk about, just because of the fact that this is a Wildbow work, and parenting and the relationships between parents and children, or, parental figures and children, figure so importantly in other Wildbow works.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be interesting to explore that as we go along.
And then we had a couple of things about just like coming up with themes and metaphors and sort of like literary structures like unreliable narrators. I think we'll definitely be trying to discuss those as they come along.
Yeah. This was a very interesting read, because reading to take notes for the podcast is, I get a lot more out of it than when I'm reading something else. So I read through it to enjoy it. Here I'm having to dig a little bit, and it's very interesting, and I definitely feel like I'm picking up a lot that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and then the last discussion question, Steel Hibiscus wanted us to make a plant-based pun in every single episode, which is an unbelievable thing for her to ask.
I don't think we'll be able to do that.
We'll see.
We will see. I got your leaf there. That was good. All right. So that's it for our first real episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening along, and we hope you'll join us for this trip into Twig. You can read Twig along with us at twigserial.wordpress.com. And if you do, and even if you don't decide to read with us, please go to Wildbow's Patreon at patreon.com/Wildbow and support him. It's how he can produce all these great things and settings he's writing. And we invite you to leave your answers to our discussion question in our Reddit thread.
Yeah. So if you want to get hold of us, you can reach us at totwigpodcast@gmail.com. We're at TO Twig Podcast on Twitter, which currently has nothing on it, but hopefully
And
that'll
apparently
change soon.
still exists, Twitter? Who knew?
Yeah, I know, right? We'll have our Reddit thread in r/parahumans. And next episode, we'll be talking about taking Route 1.3 and 1.4.
And actually, you can now also reach us and react directly on the Doof Network Discord. They've been kind enough to give us a channel as a friend of Doof. You can find us there at doofmedia.com/Discord, and then the channel is the Twigging Onto Twig channel.
Yeah, thank to them for letting us participate in their awesome community.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, as I want to do for as many of these episodes as I can accomplish. Again, with the caveat that I have not researched this very deeply or heavily, and I am not a biologist. Apparently, your intestines know where they're supposed to be. So if you get disemboweled or cut across and your guts are falling out, all a doctor really needs to do, as long as the guts themselves aren't injured, is just sort of shove them back in, sew it up, and nature will take its course, and the intestines will sort of find their way back to where they're meant to be in a relatively short period of time.
Which sounds fake.
It does sound fake. I saw a little bit about it, but I don't know. Yeah, again, I am not a biologist, crazy. And yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you. We'll talk to you next week. Or not next week, the week after next.
The week after next. Assuming I'm not, in the hospital with a newborn.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
All right. Bye.